Every night, at exactly the same time, she was watching him, and he had no idea why, until it was almost too late.
New neighbor, new secrets, and a curtain that moved just a little too fast. It was 3 in the morning when the knock finally came. And nothing after that night would ever be the same.
She left him one clue before she died. 4 words that would change everything he believed about her death. The truth had been standing right next door the whole time. He just wasn't ready to open the door and face it.
If you have ever felt like someone was watching you from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth that could destroy everything you thought you knew, then stay with me until the very end, because this story will keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because this one is going to hit different. Now, let's begin. Daniel Carter had learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep. Every night, after tucking his 6-year-old daughter Emma into bed, he would sit alone at the kitchen table of their modest 2-story house on Maple Hollow Lane, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a photograph of a woman who no longer existed except in memory. Lisa, his wife, Emma's mother, gone for 2 years now, taken in what the police report called a tragic single-vehicle accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of town. He told himself he had made peace with it. He told himself a lot of things to get through the day, that the ache in his chest would fade, that Emma's questions about when mommy is coming home would eventually stop, that the emptiness of the house at 3 a.m. was just something a man learned to live with. He worked long hours at the hardware store he co-owned with his college friend and business partner Marcus Reyes, came home to make dinner, helped Emma with her homework, and repeated the cycle the next day. It wasn't a life so much as a routine, but it was his, and he clung to it because it was the only thing keeping him upright. Emma didn't remember much about her mother anymore, and that terrified Daniel more than almost anything else. She was 4 when Lisa died, and now, at 6, most of what she knew of her came from photographs on the hallway wall and the bedtime stories Daniel told her, half memory and half invention, about a woman who used to sing off-key in the kitchen and always burn the toast on Sunday mornings. Some nights Emma would ask, in the innocent, unguarded way only a child can, "Do you think Mommy watches us from heaven?" And Daniel would have to swallow hard before answering, because the honest answer was that he didn't know what he believed anymore, only that he needed his daughter to feel safe, even if he himself hadn't felt safe in 2 years. His mother-in-law called every Sunday to check in, always ending the conversation with the same gentle warning, "You can't keep living like a ghost in your own house, Daniel." He knew she was right. He just didn't know how to be anything else. Grief, he had learned, wasn't a wound that closed. It was a room in the house you learned to walk around, careful never to look directly inside, because if you did, you might never climb back out. Then, on a gray Tuesday in October, a moving truck pulled up to the house next door, the one that had sat empty for 8 months since old Mr. Hendricks passed away. Daniel watched from his porch as boxes were carried in, half curious the way anyone is about a new neighbor, and mostly indifferent, because indifference was easier than caring about anything new. The next morning, he noticed her for the first time. A woman, maybe in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail, standing at her window with a coffee mug in her hand, looking directly at his house. Not at the street, not at the trees, at his house. When their eyes met for half a second, she stepped back from the window so quickly the curtain swayed. Daniel shrugged it off. New neighbors were curious, that was normal. But it happened again that night, and the night after that. Every evening, like clockwork, once Emma's bedroom light clicked off and Daniel settled into his usual seat at the kitchen table, he would catch a shift of the curtains next door, a shadow retreating, the faint glow of a phone screen illuminating a face that was always turned toward his window. At first, he told himself it was nothing, a lonely new neighbor, bored, maybe even attracted to him, though the thought felt strange and unwelcome. But as the days stretched into 2 weeks, the pattern didn't break. She watched him every single night, always at the same time, always with the same stillness, like she was waiting for something to happen. Her name, he learned from the mailbox label, was Sarah Mitchell. She kept to herself. She didn't wave at neighbors during the day, didn't attend the block's autumn potluck, didn't so much as make eye contact with Daniel when they crossed paths at the mailbox. And yet every night, she was there, a silhouette behind the glass, watching him like a sentinel keeping guard over something only she understood. He mentioned it, half joking, to his coworker at the hardware store, a broad-shouldered man named Pete who had worked the register for 15 years and considered himself something of a neighborhood philosopher. "New neighbor keeps staring at my house every night," Daniel said, more amused than alarmed at the time. Pete raised an eyebrow. "Staring how? Like admiring from afar staring, or like planning something staring?" Daniel laughed it off, but the question lodged itself somewhere he couldn't quite shake loose. He found himself replaying it during quiet moments at the store, while stacking paint cans or ringing up lumber, wondering which kind of staring it really was. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself a lot of things that autumn. Curiosity, Daniel would later admit, is a dangerous thing. It creeps in slowly, and before you know it, you're lying awake wondering about a stranger instead of grieving the wife you lost. He began watching the clock, waiting for the moment her light would flick on, telling himself it was concern for a peculiar neighbor, and knowing, somewhere beneath the surface, that it was something closer to obsession. Who was she? What did she want? And why did her gaze always seem to carry something heavier than simple curiosity? Something that looked, if he let himself really study it, like grief. 3 weeks after Sarah Mitchell moved in, Daniel finally worked up the nerve to speak to her. He caught her at the mailbox on a cold November morning, breath fogging in the air between them. "Sarah, right?" he said, forcing his voice into something casual. "Daniel, I'm right next door." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment, something flickered. Across her face, recognition maybe, or something closer to pain. "I know who you are," she said quietly. And then, before he could ask what she meant, she turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing in the cold with more questions than he'd started with. That night, when her light clicked on and her silhouette appeared at the window, Daniel didn't look away. For the first time, he walked to his own window and looked back. She didn't retreat this time. She simply stood there, watching him watch her. Two strangers separated by 20 feet of frost-covered lawn and a truth neither of them had spoken aloud yet. He remembered, too, the small things about Lisa that grief usually blurred, but which came back sharp and sudden in those weeks. The way she used to leave sticky notes in his lunch bag with terrible puns written on them. The way she'd insisted on driving Emma to preschool herself every morning even though it made her late for work. The way her laugh used to fill the entire downstairs of the house so completely that silence, after she was gone, had felt like a physical presence rather than an absence. He remembered the last morning, too. Rushed, ordinary, forgettable in every way a morning should be forgettable. She'd kissed Emma's forehead, told Daniel she had a work thing that evening and might be late, and backed the car out of the driveway with a wave through the windshield. He had not known, standing there with his coffee going cold in his hand, that he was watching her leave for the last time. It was around this time that the dreams started again, the ones about the night Lisa died. In them, Daniel was always standing at the edge of the highway, rain pouring down, watching the wreckage of her car burn in the distance, unable to move, unable to scream. He would wake up drenched in sweat. Emma's soft breathing down the hall, the only thing anchoring him to the present. He hadn't had those dreams in almost a year. He couldn't explain why they were returning now, except that some part of him, some instinct he didn't want to examine too closely, sensed that Sarah Mitchell's arrival and the return of his nightmares were not a coincidence. He started digging. It wasn't hard to find. A simple search of her name alongside the word Lisa Carter, his late wife's name, returned a single old social media photo. Two young women at what looked like a family barbecue, arms around each other, laughing at something outside the frame. One was unmistakably Lisa. The other, younger, softer around the edges but with the same sharp eyes, was Sarah. Daniel sat back in his chair, his heart hammering. Sarah Mitchell wasn't a stranger who had randomly moved in next door. She was Lisa's younger sister, the estranged one Lisa had rarely spoken about, the one who had vanished from the family's life years before Daniel and Lisa had even married. After some falling out nobody would explain to him. Why was she here now? Why had she moved in next door, instead of simply knocking on his front door like any normal person reconnecting with a brother-in-law and a niece she'd never met? And why did she watch him every night with an expression that looked less like curiosity and more like she was trying to work up the courage to tell him something that terrified her? The answer came from an unexpected direction: his own business partner. Marcus Reyes had been acting strange for months, ever since a routine audit of the hardware store's books had turned up discrepancies. that Marcus insisted were clerical errors. Daniel, grieving and distracted, hadn't pushed. He trusted Marcus. They'd built the store together from nothing. Groomsmen at each other's weddings, the kind of friendship Daniel thought was bulletproof. But bulletproof friendships don't make a man flinch every time his business partner's name comes up. And Daniel had started flinching in the days after learning who Sarah really was. Daniel found himself replaying old memories of Lisa, searching for any mention of a sister she'd almost never spoken of. He remembered, once, asking Lisa directly about her family, and the way her expression had closed over like a door quietly shutting. "We don't talk," she'd said simply. "It's complicated. Maybe someday." Someday had never come. Whatever had driven the sisters apart, a falling out over their parents' estate, Lisa had once vaguely mentioned, though she'd never elaborated, had swallowed years of their relationship whole, and now Daniel wondered, with a fresh ache, whether Lisa had ever tried to reach out before she died, whether there had been a phone call or an unanswered text sitting unopened in Sarah's inbox for 2 long years. He wanted to ask Sarah about it directly, but every time he worked up the courage to knock on her door, something held him back. An instinct, honed by 2 years of caution, that told him the timing had to be right, that whatever Sarah was building toward, interrupting it too soon might close her off entirely. So instead, he watched, the way she had watched him, and he waited. One evening, after closing the store, Daniel found an old flash drive Lisa had kept in her desk, one he'd never had the heart to go through after she died. Buried among family photos and grocery lists was a folder labeled simply M.R. Do Not Open. Inside were financial documents, transfers, falsified invoices, a paper trail suggesting Marcus had been quietly siphoning money from the business for years, funneling it into a second account under a name Daniel didn't recognize, and a note in Lisa's handwriting dated 3 days before her death. "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Tell Sarah. She'll know what to do." The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. Lisa had known. Lisa had found out about Marcus's theft, and 3 days later, she was dead on a rain-soaked highway in a crash the police had ruled a simple loss of control. Daniel had never questioned it. Grief doesn't leave room for suspicion. But now the question lodged itself in his chest like a blade. What if it hadn't been an accident at all? That was the night he finally understood why Sarah watched him. She wasn't a stalker, and she wasn't simply grieving her sister from a distance. She had spent 2 years piecing together the truth about what happened to Lisa, and when she'd finally traced the threads back to Marcus Reyes, she'd moved next door to Daniel, the one person who could either help her expose the truth, or, if he was somehow involved, become the next threat to silence. She had been watching him every night, not out of affection, but out of fear and calculation, trying to determine whether the man her sister had loved was safe to trust. Or another obstacle standing between her and Justice Daniel didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with the flash drive in front of him, replaying every strange moment of the last 2 years, Marcus's nervousness whenever Lisa's name came up, the store, E's mysterious clerical errors, the rushed, oddly insistent police closure of Lisa's case despite an unexplained mechanical failure in a car that had passed inspection 2 weeks earlier. Every piece he'd dismissed as coincidence now clicked into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. At 11 p.m., his phone buzzed. Marcus. "Hey man, can't sleep either, huh? Saw your light on. We still good for the supplier meeting tomorrow?" The message was ordinary, friendly even, but Daniel's hands trembled as he read it. How would Marcus know his light was on unless he was watching the house? A cold thought settled over him. What if Sarah wasn't the only one keeping watch on Maple Hollow Lane? He thought about calling his mother-in-law, about telling her everything, but stopped himself. Each time, unwilling to hand her a fresh wound before he had enough proof to back it up. He thought about the years he and Marcus had spent building the store together. The late nights stocking shelves before opening day, the small loan Marcus's father had co-signed when the banks turned them down, the toast Marcus had given at Daniel and Lisa's wedding, voice cracking with genuine emotion. None of it made sense against the cold, deliberate cruelty suggested by the documents on the flash drive. And yet the note in Lisa's handwriting did not lie. "Tell Sarah, she'll know what to do." Lisa had trusted her estranged sister with her life, quite literally over the husband sleeping beside her, Not because she didn't trust Daniel, he came to understand later, but because she hadn't wanted to burden him with a truth so dangerous until she had proof solid enough to protect him from it too. The next 2 days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Daniel went to work, smiled through the supplier meeting, picked Emma up from school, all while turning the evidence over and over in his mind, trying to decide what to do. Go to the police? He had no proof they wouldn't dismiss again, especially if Marcus had connections he didn't know about. And the note from Lisa made it clear she hadn't trusted the police either. Confront Marcus directly? That felt like walking into a trap with his eyes open. Talk to Sarah? That felt like the only real option, except he had no idea how to approach a woman who had spent 2 years watching him from behind a curtain, sizing him up as either an ally or an enemy. He didn't have to make the choice. Sarah made it for him. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against his front door, urgent and afraid. Daniel bolted upright, heart slamming, and grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the bed, more out of habit than expectation of ever needing it. He crept downstairs, checked on Emma, still asleep, safe, and approached the door. "Daniel!" Sarah's voice, low and shaking, came through the wood. "Open the door, please. It's about Lisa. It's about Marcus. He knows I've been digging. He's coming." Daniel yanked the door open. Sarah stood on his porch in a coat thrown hastily over pajamas, a manila folder clutched to her chest, eyes wide with a fear that stripped away every ounce of the calculated distance she'd kept for weeks. "I've been watching you," she said before he could speak, the words tumbling out fast, desperate. "I know how that sounds. I had to know if you were part of it, if you knew what he did to her. I couldn't just walk up and tell a stranger my sister might have been murdered. But I have proof now, real proof. Bank records, a mechanic's statement about the brake line in her car, and Marcus figured out I've been asking questions. He called me an hour ago. He knows. He's not going to let this go quietly." The two of them stood in the doorway as the full weight of 2 years of grief, secrecy, and suspicion collapsed into a single unbearable moment. Daniel pulled her inside, locked the door, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not feel alone in his fear. He felt like he finally had an ally who understood exactly what he had lost, because she had lost it too. They spent the next hour at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had spent 2 years drowning quietly in grief, laying out every piece of evidence between them. Lisa's flash drive. Sarah's folder, thick with financial statements, an independent mechanic's written statement proving the brake line on Lisa's car had been deliberately compromised, and text messages Sarah had intercepted from an old family friend inside the auto shop who'd grown suspicious of a favor Marcus had asked for 2 years earlier. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened into something undeniable. Marcus Reyes had been stealing from the business for years. Lisa had discovered it, and rather than risk exposure, he had arranged for her death to look like an accident. Headlights swept briefly across the living room curtains. A car, slowing, then stopping just past the driveway. Sarah froze. That's him. What followed was not the stuff of movies. No dramatic chase through the streets, no gunfight in the rain. It was quieter and, in its own way, more terrifying. Marcus, disheveled and unraveling, pounding on the door minutes later, not bothering to hide his desperation anymore, demanding the folder, insisting he could still fix this if they just handed everything over and stayed quiet. Daniel, standing between his daughter's sleeping form upstairs and the man who had smiled at his wedding and quietly destroyed his family, found a steadiness in himself he didn't know he still had. He didn't open the door. Instead, with Sarah beside him, phone already dialed, he stood firm behind the locked door and said the only words that mattered. "It's over, Marcus. The police are already on their way, and so is everything you tried to bury." It wasn't a bluff. Sarah had called ahead before she'd ever knocked on Daniel's door, a safeguard in case things went wrong. Patrol cars arrived within minutes, red and blue light washing over Maple Hollow Lane as neighbors' porch lights flicked on one by one. Marcus didn't run. In the end, men like him rarely do. The same cowardice that let him orchestrate a woman's death rather than face financial ruin left him standing frozen on Daniel's lawn, offering excuses to officers who had long since stopped listening. In the chaos of flashing lights and raised voices on the lawn, Daniel found a strange, still moment where he looked back at his own front door and saw Emma standing there in her pajamas, roused by the commotion, eyes wide with confusion rather than fear. He crossed the yard in 3 strides and knelt in front of her, blocking her view of the officers leading Marcus toward a patrol car. "It's okay, baby," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "Everyone's safe. I promise you, everyone's safe now." She studied him with a solemn seriousness only children manage at 3 in the morning, then looked past him toward Sarah, who stood trembling but upright at the edge of the driveway. "Is that the lady who watches our house?" Emma asked, and despite everything, Daniel felt something in his chest loosen enough to almost laugh. "Yeah," he said softly, "that's her. I think she's going to be around a lot more now." The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, reopened investigations, and a mechanic's testimony that finally gave Lisa's death a name it had been denied for 2 years. Not an accident, but a calculated act of violence to protect a lie. The trial itself lasted 11 days. Daniel sat through every one of them, Sarah beside him in the same wooden pew each morning, watching as the prosecution laid out a case built from bank statements, a mechanic's sworn testimony, and the trembling voice of a former auto shop employee who finally admitted, under oath, what Marcus had asked him to do to a certain car's brake line 2 years earlier. As a favor, just this once. Marcus never took the stand in his own defense. In the end, his lawyer's best argument was a plea for leniency based on years of community involvement, a defense that rang hollow against the image of Lisa's burning car that the jury could not unsee. Marcus Reyes was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted, not just for embezzlement, but for the far graver crime of silencing the one person who had discovered his betrayal. Justice, when it finally came, didn't erase 2 years of grief, but it gave Daniel something he hadn't had since the funeral, the truth, and with it, the ability to finally begin healing instead of merely surviving. In one of their late-night conversations during that difficult stretch, Sarah finally told Daniel why she and Lisa had stopped speaking all those years ago. A bitter argument after their father's funeral, over money neither of them had really wanted, that had spiraled into years of stubborn silence neither sister had known how to break. "I kept thinking there'd be time," Sarah admitted, staring into her coffee cup rather than at him. "That's the cruelest part. You always think there's more time, right up until there isn't." Daniel understood that particular grief better than almost anyone alive, and in sharing it, something between them shifted from wary alliance into something that felt, for the first time in years, like genuine friendship. Sarah stayed, not out of obligation, but because somewhere in those frightening weeks, watching each other from opposite windows had turned into something neither of them had expected. A partnership built first on grief and justice, and slowly, carefully, into something warmer. She became a constant presence in Emma's life, the aunt the little girl had never known she had, filling a space in their small, broken family that Daniel had assumed would stay empty forever. She taught Emma the same off-key lullabies Lisa used to hum, small fragments of melody she remembered from their own childhood, and watching his daughter fall asleep to a tune that connected her, however faintly, to the mother she barely remembered. Daniel understood that Sarah had given his family back something he had thought was lost for good. Not a replacement for Lisa, but a living thread back to her. On the 1-year anniversary of that 3 a.m. knock, Daniel stood on his porch and looked at the house next door, no longer watching for a shadow in the window, because there was nothing left to hide from each other anymore. Sarah stepped out onto her own porch, coffee in hand, and smiled at him the way neighbors do when they've become something closer to family. Emma ran between the 2 yards, laughing, unaware of how close her small world had come to permanent silence, and grateful, in the quiet way children are, for an aunt who had simply always been there. There were still hard days, anniversaries that ambushed him without warning, a song on the radio that could undo an entire afternoon, moments when he caught Emma humming a tune Lisa used to sing and had to leave the room before his composure broke in front of her. Healing, he had come to understand, was not a straight line from broken to whole. It was a slow, uneven climb, full of setbacks that no longer felt like defeats, only like part of the terrain. But for the first time since the funeral, he was climbing instead of simply enduring, and that distinction, small as it seemed from the outside, felt like everything from the inside. Daniel thought about Lisa often, not with the raw, disorienting grief of those first 2 years, but with a steadier kind of love, the kind that comes from finally knowing the whole truth instead of carrying an unanswered question. She had left him one final gift before she died, a note, 4 words scrawled in a hurry, that had led her sister to his door and, in the end, brought their broken family back together. If something happens to me, it had. And somehow, impossibly, love and justice had found their way back to Maple Hollow Lane anyway. Some evenings, out of habit more than necessity now, Daniel still glanced toward Sarah's window after Emma had gone to bed. She was rarely there anymore, not because she had stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to watch for, no danger to monitor, no truth left to verify from a careful distance. Instead, more often than not, she was simply at his kitchen table, sharing the quiet, ordinary hours that grief had once made unbearable and that trust, slowly rebuilt, had made peaceful again. It was, Daniel thought, the strangest kind of gift, that the very watching which had once filled him with suspicion had ultimately been the thing that saved his family and brought it back together. The lesson Daniel carried forward, the one he would tell Emma when she was old enough to understand, was simple. The truth does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it watches quietly from a window for weeks, gathering the courage to knock. And when it finally does, in the middle of the night, afraid and uncertain, the bravest thing you can do is open the door. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more emotional stories like this one, and leave a comment telling us what part hit you the hardest. Thank you for watching until the very end.